I love that this panel is going to help all of you get prepared to have a magical experience.
It's okay to forego a movie if you know that you need to write.
People who rise the ranks with you are the people who are going to be your connections for a long time. I think that's the most important thing.
To be a good writer, you have to know what you care about. And I just think that the only way to do that is to experience more, read more, watch more.
Getting people to watch the art that I like, I feel like it's a job I've been doing since I was a teenager. I love doing that.
Find your favorite person that provides film criticism and be nitpicky. What is that one thing that they don't do that you wish they did? You have to incorporate some type of you.
Shout out to RT Critics Lab for providing talks like this.
Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us. My name is David Hatkoff. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the executive director of NewFest, and welcome to day 10 of the 37th annual New York LGBTQ+ Film Festival. And we have been looking forward to this day all festival long. Our NBCU plus Rotten Tomatoes, the NewFest experience, which I love. I want everything to be an experience, and I think we're gonna give you an experience today. So thank you for joining us. NBCU has been a longtime supporter of NewFest, and last year we had the great privilege of connecting with the Rotten Tomatoes team and hearing about the work that they've been doing as part of their Critics Lab series. And really found, I believe, an instant spiritual connection. Because what festivals do and what critics do is help people be aware of and guide them to and encourage them to find film. There are some hardcore cinephiles, I'm sure we have some of you in the audience, and we have some folks who feel overwhelmed by the options and the vast offerings that one could see in a theater or at home. And what festivals do and what critics do is help sort of narrow that landscape. And when you find a critic who you trust, or you find an outlet that you trust, and then you can start to build your watch list and your schedule and discover things. And so we really, as soon as we started talking about what the Critics Lab is and how it elevates critics and amplifies voices, and the interest that Rotten Tomatoes had in really speaking to marginalized communities and voices that are not always given a platform, we got really excited. And so this is the second year of that partnership. We had a wonderful conversation last year, and really wanted to do something a little bit different this year. And so this year we are going to be focusing on queer critical archives, which is also something I think that our two entities have in common, which is for NewFest and festivals like ours, we really try to bring in, alongside the new films, new short films, new features, legacy titles, because that helps us understand where we have been. It helps us understand where we are right now. And it feels particularly meaningful, I think, today to be at the LGBT Community Center, a place that has been the birthplace of movements like ACT UP and so many incredible, important community services. There's a big protest happening literally outside these walls right now. And queer film, we believe, is an act of rebellion and is a protest in its own way. And so this year, by looking at films like Desert Hearts or My Beautiful Laundrette or The Celluloid Closet, we've been able to really understand sort of where we were at 30, 40 years ago, what it's like today to experience those films, what's changed, and also give us a vision of where we would like to go to. And Rotten Tomatoes has taken on a really crucial project, I think, by surfacing criticism around some of these films from 30, 40 years ago, which helps contribute to that landscape and that discourse and that dialogue. And so I'm constantly impressed by what Rotten Tomatoes does for the community, film lovers, journalists, critics, general audience members, and we're incredibly proud to be in partnership with them. And to kick things off, I am delighted to welcome back for a second year to moderate a conversation with a truly distinguished group of panelists, NewFest senior programmer, Murtada Elfadl.
Thank you, David, so much for those words and for introducing the panel, Spotlighting Queer Critical Archives. It is my pleasure and honor to introduce the panelists, Valerie Complex, critic and filmmaker. Richard Lawson, critic. And Alex Schmitter, Senior Director of Entertainment at GLAAD. So hello to everyone in the audience. Welcome to this panel. Thank you for joining us for the Critics Lab from Rotten Tomatoes. Critics Lab is an ongoing resource for critics, and it offers them workshops, advice, tools, and support throughout their critical career. There is a QR code that critics in the audience can scan to get more of our resources. And now to this panel, Spotlighting Queer Critical Archives. Valerie, Richard, Alex, I am so in awe. I'm very honored to be in your presence. I respect and admire all your work. And so I'm looking forward to hearing from you about queer criticism. And I want to maybe start by if each one of you can tell us about your current role and when you started reading criticism and what you noticed early on about how queer films are talked about.
Again, my name is Valerie Complex. I have been a critic for the last 10 or 11 years, and I did a short stint at Trade Deadline. I was there for 3 years. And what I first really took a notice of like queer criticism and how that worked out, I would say in 2016 when Moonlight came out, and I started to focus on what people were saying, and then I was like, wait, are queer people writing about how they felt about the film? Because I see a bunch of like white dudes, and I don't, some of them may have been queer, but the criticism didn't read as such. I personally didn't review Moonlight at the time, but it did flag the question in my head, like, who's talking about this? And what are they saying? Is there context? What is being said behind the words? And so it sort of sparked this thing where I was like, okay, well, I am queer. I need to start putting myself out there to talk about these things too. And yeah, that's kind of how that has happened. And right now I'm back into the freelance game, and I started film school because something's wrong with me, clearly. I started film school in September and learning how films work in a very different way, which has influenced the way I write about cinema.
Hi, I'm Richard. I got into film criticism for the money. It's not working out too well. No, I was the chief critic at Vanity Fair for 12 years until just the end of the summer. I'm freelancing now and doing podcast stuff. And I started reading criticism in general. I guess my first subscription to Entertainment Weekly was when I was maybe like 9. And I became religiously obsessed with it. And Owen Gleiberman and Lisa Shoresbaum were the two critics there. And I read the Boston Globe, my hometown newspaper. Their critic at the time was a guy named Jay Carr. And as far as I know, they are all straight. And even as a kid, I would read certain reviews of films and say, I feel like there's something that's either being joked about here or not talked about at all. And it was only till I got older and started seeing queer films on my own and then reading reviews and feeling like there's a disconnect here. So I really, once the internet really got up and running, I could kind of seek out more of that. But I remember seeing The Talented Mr. Ripley and falling in love with it. I had just come out. And yeah, it's a dark movie, and maybe the gay character in that movie isn't very heroic, but I just was captivated by it. And the reviews I read, while positive, just sort of eschewed that whole aspect of it, or maybe there was a kind of jokey sentence about it. So I guess maybe years later when I became a professional critic, I was like, well, I want to kind of not lead with being a gay person writing about queer film, but make sure that that isn't a component of what I write if the subject matter merits it.
Hi, Alex Schmitter. I am the Senior Director of Entertainment at GLAAD, the nation's leading LGBTQ media advocacy organization, and I am not a critic. However, I have deep respect for the work of critics and film criticism, especially because in my work at GLAAD, I really look at the broad landscape of what LGBTQ films are out there, what is gaining traction, what is not, and so much of that is reliant on how people review and talk about those titles in a very early stage of when they premiere, what the pathway to an awards campaign looks like. And so in my work, I'm consistently consulting with a number of different entertainment executives, network studios, and part of why I am so honored to be on this stage with people I so deeply respect is because the life cycle of a film is dependent on how it's written about, and especially by who.
That sort of begs the question. So one of the amazing queer classics that we played at this year's festival is Desert Hearts. And thanks to the wonderful work that Rotten Tomatoes has done, we have looked at all the reviews from that time. And like you said, Richard, about Ripley, mostly positive. And I don't want to call like the god of criticism Roger Ebert, but he did call it unsubtle. And, you know, speaking to the audience after watching that film at the festival, basically everyone was kind of talking about how subtle and it didn't push the emotions too much. And so it sort of begs the question, like, is it unsubtle because it's queer? So I want to ask all of you, how do you recognize a queer voice? Like, when you're reading criticism, is it an understanding of the lived experience? Besides that, is it aesthetics? I know we all, as queer people, are maybe more interested in other elements than people who are not queer.
I mean, it's certainly how certain aspects of the film are talked about. Like the Desert Hearts example is perusing these, you know, contemporaneous reviews from 40 years ago on Rotten Tomatoes that they've archived. It's amazing. A lot of the reviews from, you know, critics at major outlets, mostly straight white men, they talk about the sex scene as if it's like a car chase. They're like, well, you know, the acting is good, the cinematography is good, there's a pretty good sex scene. Like, they're talking about it as if it's like something to be checked off on a list, not in a way that it's actually textually important to the story, to these characters. And that's when you can detect, I think, a sort of non-queer lens, certainly. But on the other side of things, yeah, I think it's when a love story, for example, is written about not as a sort of like odd novelty, but it's just a story about two people falling in love. And, you know, I'm happy to recognize when a film is doing something interesting or groundbreaking or rarely seen, so you do make it sort of distinctly a review of a queer film. But otherwise, I think you can just talk about the text of the movie. And I think a lot of times straight critics really have to kind of make a distinction between themselves and the thing they're writing about. I mean, I think most potently, the reviews for Brokeback Mountain, I think there are a lot of people who are still writing today who should be pretty embarrassed about how they wrote about that movie.
I have another example about Brokeback Mountain, but I might get to it later. But I find like also like the reviews aren't textured at all. And like the way Desert Hearts kind of came out at a time where films about lesbians were few and far in between, or I'll say, you know, WLW relationships weren't really talked about. And so especially now when we see those types of films, we're like, this is breaking new ground in this way, or this is breaking new ground in this way. And the fact that Desert Hearts just kind of existed in that time period was a huge deal. But like you said, Richard, they're just like, it's a checklist. It's like, oh, you know, they're women and great and romance, and that's great too, or not great. I think that a lot of that is sort of missing from that, because I think that's important. What is the intersection between, you know, femininity or womanness, you know, and queerness, and that is all like missing. The Village Voice existed back then, and they were doing criticism, but I don't remember seeing a review from anyone from the Village Voice. Back then, there was a lot more like printed queer media where you could find reviews. They may not have been on Rotten Tomatoes, but they were in print. So I think it's important to remember that as well. They did exist out there. You just may not be able to find them right now.
I was just going to add to both of you. I think, too, something that I appreciate about film criticism, especially from people who are from the communities that are purported to being represented, is that there's an awareness of what other stories exist in the collection, in the collective, and how this one arrives into the current culture. And to both of your point, to just look at the beats that something hits without acknowledging how it exists in a greater context, I think can often miss. Something that I see also as a producer of documentaries specifically, I somehow have gotten into producing a lot of trans people in sports films. I fell into that. I don't know quite how, but what's interesting when those films are reviewed, especially by people outside of the community, is it's about dissecting the story within the culture rather than the craft. And I think something I so appreciate about these conversations that Rotten Tomatoes puts together and being on this panel with you all is that criticism is a craft, it's a skill, it's an expertise. And I think that's really important to acknowledge, not only of the personal experience, but the being aware of what else is out there and how is it in conversation with other things. Yeah. Again, what I so respect about media criticism in this way is that there's a media literacy fluency component that you incorporate into how you're talking about a piece of art or a film. And I think for people who aren't aware that some of the people who are being sought out to review a project are being done so because it's to the benefit of the studio and not necessarily for the sincere, genuine review of it all, I think that's something that's really important to just get out in the open and start having a real conversation about, because then we can maybe start looking at how to disrupt those systems that don't just benefit people who are saying what people and entities want them to say, but are saying the truth of what they know from their own experience.
But I will say really quickly, like, Letterboxd has been cool because, you know, there will be like diehard, you know, queer cinema fans who have like these lists that have films that I've never heard of in my life. And I'm like, oh, that's something cool to watch. And then that community does sort of band together, and they will, you know, support and like promote the films that may not be mainstream. So I do like that aspect of Letterboxd.
I mean, everything that democratizes anything, I think, is a good thing. I'm going to change the conversation a little bit to, so, you know, all of us at one time worked or wrote for some very mainstream publications. And Richard, I remember one year you put the Lawrence Garfaya film The Meddler as your #1 film.
I did.
Of the year.
Over Moonlight. Ooh, sorry. Moonlight was #2. Moonlight was #2.
But and then another you put BPM, and from Bruno Campier was #1, which is a French wonderful film about AIDS. And so, you know, when I read those lists, I was like, you know, I didn't know you then, but I knew of you, of course. But I was like, oh, he's definitely gay. So I want to ask all of you about sort of how do you queer up these sort of mainstream spaces?
That was one of the really fun little secret projects of mine at Vanity Fair. When I showed up there in 2013, I actually was not hired as a film critic. I kind of wormed my way into that job. It had never existed before. They had never had a full-time staff critic until I was there. And VF was had a certain swishiness to it maybe, but there weren't a lot of gay staffers, there weren't, especially writers. And Graydon Carter, who was the editor at the time, his movie taste tended toward, if it's about World War II, it's great, and everything else was maybe not so great. And I love World War II movies, but I just, so I would find ways in a review of a mainstream movie to focus on a particular aspect of it that maybe my straight colleagues were not. At film festivals, to seek out, I had my marching orders about certain movies I had to see, but if I had time to fill, I would seek out queer movies and then I would pull stunts like putting The Meddler, at number one, even though, Moonlight is also a queer movie, and also, more than The Meddler is even, but yeah, that was kind of a little joke, a little wink, and I meant it, I love that movie, don't get me wrong, but I think within the bounds that were sort of presented to me, I found ways to just come at things from a slightly different angle, and it's something that I think people appreciated. It might not have made me the most visible critic in America or anything like that. There are, those positions are typically held by straight people, but I think the community of people I was essentially writing to seemed to respond to it, which is nice.
Because every Pride Month I was doing something every week, and then I would have this big round table on Zoom at the end of the month with queer creators, or filmmakers, and critics and stuff like that, where we would have these big discussions. So also working at a trade will allot you lots of opportunities, because people email you and they want you to see their film, they want you to meet the actors, and they kind of want you to become a part of the community that they've created around their film. So a lot of people will reach out to me, and I was seeing everything that was even had queer subtext. I was seeing stuff, and I thought that was a huge opportunity as well, because there are some films that aren't promoted as queer, but then you watch it and you're like, oh, so this, exists. I guess what comes to mind is The Novitiate, which wasn't sort of promoted as this thing, but then you watch it and you're like,
Nuns,
oh,
very queer.
So it was oh, okay, so there's this, and then you get to talk about that. And so I think even more so than talking about something that is overtly queer is finding something that might be subtextual, or finding the queer component in something. I wrote this big thing about Midsommar and how it had this sort of queer community element, and a lot of people fought me on it, but I was like, this is the beauty of being a someone who's queer, who writes about cinema, is that I can give my opinion on what I find queer about it, if I can, sort of relate it to an important aspect or something about the community. So that's kind of to answer you.
Yeah, I think that also there was a part of me that really took pleasure, and still does, in kind of showing the artifice of the other side to themselves. I think that one year I put Mamma Mia, Here We Go Again, the sequel movie, which is a beautiful, genuinely wonderful movie, I think, and way better than the first one. And I put that on my top 10 of the year list. And the predictable people were all mad, and I was like, "How is this any different from Avengers? It's your characters you like; they're back together again. There's another adventure, and I just think there are constant reminders that we are living in a cultural world that is defined pretty rigidly by other people, and that this stuff is serious, this stuff is frivolous. There's been a change in that to some extent, in poptimism and all that stuff, but I still think, especially maybe in the film world, that so girlier stuff or queenier stuff or whatever is a kind of viewed as a little oddity. But we're all supposed to know what the fucking MCU is, And I like the MCU, but like it's.
Do you?
I mean, not anymore, but.
Alex, so you're on the other side. Your space is queer, but you work with a lot of non-queer spaces. So how are you queering up these spaces? Besides, telling them about the meddler.
Always. Well, I think it's really interesting talking about queerness as subtext and sensibility, because for GLAAD as an organization, when we were measuring the quality and quantity of LGBTQ characters in television, film, video games, what have you, we do it by the Vito Russo test, which is 3 criteria. The character or storyline must be explicitly queer. There can't be any kind of ambiguity or interpretation of like guess the gay or guess the trans. It has to be on screen. Number 2, that character can't be removed without changing the plot, so they have to be instrumental to what that story is. And the 3rd, that the character cannot be solely defined by their sexual orientation or gender identity as the one characteristic of who they are. And I think to the question about the mainstream, which is mostly where I work, I often call GLAAD an indirect service organization. We work on behalf of the queer community to reach that audience who may not be personally familiar with LGBTQ people in their lives, but they get to know characters through the television, film, or video games that they watch and play. And so whenever we're looking at representation, it does have to be on screen, because we don't know how much the audience knows about that actor or about the story behind the story that is actually what they're consuming. Bless you. And I think that's important to say out loud, because as a lot of the different platforms proliferate and audiences are everywhere and we're self-segregating based on what we only want to see and not necessarily seeking out other kinds of content, I think it makes it that much more important that we have inclusion in any genre, in any story across the board, and specifically for GLAAD, that it be obvious. This is a queer character. This is who they are outside of these certain characteristics, and they are key to the plot as we are key to every community and every relationship dynamic we're in.
I love that. So looking at some of the titles that the classics we had on this year's festival, one that jumped out to me is My Beautiful Laundrette. So thanks to the work of RT, there is a lot of archival reviews now, and the score is 98%. So this one was very favorably reviewed, basically loved. But when I look and read, going deep into some of these reviews, especially when people are talking about the acting, it is all about Daniel Day-Lewis. It was a big year for him. He made that movie and A Room with a View, so he was a star. That was his Star is Born moment. But that's sort of like Gordon Warnacki, who was as good, and that movie only works because the two of them are in sync and have this amazing chemistry. Almost never mentioned. I mean, he's Pakistani, so maybe people don't see Pakistani people, but anyway. So I want to ask you about sort of, what do you try to sort of like, in a queer film, when you're writing about it, how do you make sure that the queer elements are talked about? And maybe if you can give us an example, a recent or old one or anything.
I think you take them seriously, I think that, and you don't bring, you want to bring attention to it without being like, look, there's gay stuff in this, I mean, maybe that's kind of the intention, but I think a lot of reviews written, that we looked at for this panel and just in, the general course of my reading reviews over the many years, is that it tends to be a sort of wink or a sort of dismissal or whatever. I mean, the Laundrette thing is insane. I remember seeing that movie for the first time because I was like, I want to see more Daniel Day-Lewis, and I was like, but who's that other guy? Good God, and I hadn't heard anything about him. I think the way to do it, at least as I see it, as I approach it in my writing, is I know what I would want to know about. If I see a trailer or hear that a movie's coming out, like Pillion, an upcoming movie that from the UK that's about two gay men. I was like very, when I wrote my review from Cannes of that movie, I thought of what a friend would text me saying like, well, not just like, what do you see, but, more deeper than that, and so I try to keep that in mind, because I think that that's the reason you do sometimes want, not always, doesn't have to be, but you do want, sort of own voices, because we're going to be watching a movie differently, and I want to kind of honor that. And I'm proud of the fact that for over a decade, a big publication like Vanity Fair kind of was forced to have that perspective.
It depends on what it's about and what the story is and what's featured. But I usually add a bit of like cultural commentary. One that comes to mind is there was a film called Port Authority that came out a couple of years ago, and I wasn't working at a trade at the time, and I had written this review. I am originally from New York. I was born in the Bronx. That's where I was raised. I moved to Harlem when I was 13 years old. I am deeply ingrained in what is happening in New York. When I was 15 years old, I used to hang out at the pier with trans women, the stroll, as they called it. I saw all of that stuff. And so this particular film was about that. And I was like, here's everything wrong with that. And I was able to add the different intersections that I existed at, and proving why the film went about it the incorrect way. And look, the trades loved it. The white men, they loved Port Authority. My review came out, and you never saw the film again. And that wasn't what I was trying to accomplish. But I think when people read it, they saw that authenticity and was like, oh, I believe her, so let me skip this. So I always try to add, if I can, a bit of social commentary or any of the intersections that I exist at. I try to add that in. And even with films that feature lesbians, I'm like, lesbians don't have sex this way, or just different things, different things that I try to sort of add about that to either add to the authenticity of the story that's been told or to take away from it because it didn't, So I guess that's kind of how I queered them up, just by adding personal anecdotes and experience.
Which I so appreciate, and I also think, to Valerie's point, it's so important to have a multiplicity of these voices talking about these films, because sometimes it is hard to be the only one to step up and say, this actually wasn't as good as everyone is saying, and here's why. And then have a dialogue among different critics of diverse perspectives, because I think one of the frustrations I often experience in my work at GLAAD is that, to Val, your point, there will be a film that is celebrated out of Cannes, and I won't name it today, but it will have...
You can.
You can guess what it is. It was last year.
Did it win 2 Oscars? Or?
Just 2, though.
Yeah.
But it got so much praise because it was representing communities that are not often seen on screen in this kind of very grandiose way, rather than looking at the authenticity of it and the resonance with what it actually was, and not just the tokenism of the representation on screen. We were working closely alongside Rotten Tomatoes to try to get more access to critics to see it earlier on, because we know how important it is to have that multiplicity of voices, that pluralism in dialogue about a project, because it really does impact the trajectory of a project and how audiences are receiving it. Because if your criticism or your review of Port Authority was the only at the time that it would have been great for you to be able to be in dialogue with others, either sharing points or differing, but at least coming from that authentic perspective.
The thing about when I had wrote about Port Authority is, I'm trying to be careful. I was not writing for a trade at the time, So being a part of those conversations, I was not let in the door. It wasn't until I started working at a trade that those people were interested in what I had to say, right? So because there is a level of legitimacy, quote unquote legitimacy, that comes with working at a place like Vanity Fair or Deadline or Variety, that because I had seen it at Cannes and I wasn't working for a trade. I was just there as someone who loved cinema and international cinema and wanted to check out the queer film that was there. And it happens a lot. And I also think that studios should be interested in these different perspectives, because then films come out and they're confused as to the reception. And it's like, you know, they took what was happening out of a film festival at face value. And then when people got, you know, it was outside of that bubble, it was like, well, what happened? And it's like, I don't know, maybe did you ask somebody else? Like, what? So I think that getting that perspective, that outside perspective, is important. And we're losing that right now.
We are definitely losing it. There's less and less of us at these places. There's just less critics in general, unfortunately. That's what we need to all deal with. So I want to ask you about sort of like, there is this tendency in some publications to, you know, assign by race, by gender, by sexuality, which, you know, we just talked about how important queer voices are, which is, I guess, a good thing, but also I want to write about everything. I don't want to just write about queer films or films about Africans in the diaspora or films about Black life, you know, the lived experience of Black people in America. Like, yes, this is my life and my experience, but also it's just like, that's not all I know. I love French movies. I love movies from Hong Kong. Like, give me more. And especially when you are like not the lead critic at one of these publications, you always sort of like, I get a lot of Tyler Perry. So anyway, I want to ask you, which is not my thing, but anyway. So I want to ask you, how do you feel about that? Because I think it's a double-edged sword, right? Like, sometimes it's good and sometimes, I don't know. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I mean, I was mostly the only critic at VF. We had Cam Collins there for a couple years, who's a Black critic. Cassie DaCosta, also based in California. And I think we tried to be sensitive about that, because that is a question of like, well, should Cam review this because it's a major Black filmmaker, and we do want that perspective. It helped that both Cam and I are gay, so that wasn't a problem when there was a gay movie. But Cam also did want to review Star Wars and did want to review everything that anyone else would want to cover. But I think if zooming out to the industry as a whole, I think you see a ton of that pigeonholing, and it's getting worse because there are just fewer jobs, and it seems a lot of outlets are just going to go to just basically only freelancers and no staff critic at all, and so there's not, they can just assign specific movies to specific people, and kind of keep the conversation siloed off that way, and it's unfair to the critics, who are like, put me in, coach, I can write about whatever. But editors who I think are trying to do good are a little too scared to not do it.
I also think I think I don't want to say I took that for granted, because my fear is that this upcoming year we won't really see any of that. Look, during Black History Month, I stayed paid, okay? During, Pride Month, people will reach out and everything. And I just worry that, like, this upcoming year, since they don't have to do that anymore, they won't. And it's less about me making money and writing as opposed to, like, are they going to continue to make room for them to even reach out to me to ask? One other thing that I realized was like, oh my gosh, I'm trying to be careful with everything I say, but
safe space.
It became a necessity for me to do that because, something would come out and then, someone who wasn't necessarily the demographic would write about it and it would be like, oh my God, like, bro, what are you talking about? So, and I'd be like, dang, I maybe I should have like put my name in the hat to review it. But one good thing is, there have been films that have come out where, senior critics at outlets I've worked for who have been like, nope, she definitely should write about it and put her perspective at the forefront. And I thought that was pretty cool to have people who were like in my corner who were like, no, we think this person has the perspective. So I don't know, I guess it's a bit of a double-edged sword because it's like, well, thank you for giving me all the Black stuff, but also, make sure that you look out for me as well when I want to see Poor Things or I want to watch a French film, Paris 13th District or whatever. Yeah. So it's difficult to talk about because there are pros and cons to each side, at least the way I see it. Because look, if somebody who is a Black queer film critic can stay employed and make money, they should. Mm-hmm. If that's how their voice is that, or if that's when their voice is the loudest, fine, do that. I want to hear from that person, but that shouldn't be the only time.
Absolutely. Alex, what do you think?
It's interesting because in my work at GLAAD, it feels so much like I'm trying and we're trying as best we can to educate people to make better creative decisions all the time. We're always giving notes and feedback and saying, here's what we see with the project you've brought to us. Here are all the landmines. We hope you step on them intentionally rather than accidentally. So here's all the information. Here's what we anticipate the audience will react to. Here's why. But it's up to you to make the decision. And I think where I'm seeing alignment here is if we could all be more conscious of our biases and name those and be aware of them and surround ourselves with people that are going to have different perspectives and opinions, we'll be living more diversely, and therefore I think our ability to take in the world will also be more honest about what the world is and what it looks like, and that something I often come across is critics being afraid to critique trans stories. And I'm actually like, no, please, there are some really bad trans stories, and sometimes told by trans people. And we need to be more honest about that and also celebrate the really amazing ones and not be afraid. But I think that requires relationship. I think we have to be able to talk honestly about that rather than skirt around it and only check the boxes.
There was a movie at Cannes, a while ago now, called Girl, that was from Belgium, and I think a lot of American the American critics who did write about it, who were all, as far as I'm aware, cisgender, they gave it pretty good reviews because I think they felt a little scared to not give it a good review, and then Netflix said, oh, great, we have a hit on our hands, let's buy it. And then they brought it stateside, and everyone was like, what the fuck is this? Like, people were like horrified. And I think, I don't want to oversell like the power of critics, but in that instance, I think a few overly polite reviews caused a problem for all involved months later, which is fascinating.
I'm sorry, Alex, did you want to? I was going to say, going with all that you said, I was thinking about my Beautiful Laundrette, and I think about the way that films are promoted as well, and there's a certain expectation when people know a film is queer and they walk into it versus how it's been promoted and they don't know, even if the context, even if it's like contextual, overt. And for example, I've brought this up quite a bit, but for example, I look at the IMDb descriptions for Portrait of a Lady on Fire versus Brokeback Mountain, and I brought them up because I was shocked, and I figured this out.
I love this.
About a year ago. So this is because the reason why I'm bringing this up is because there's an element of misogyny and that is taking place, and transphobia that is taking place. But so for Brokeback Mountain, this is how it's described, the log line on IMDb. Two shepherds fall for each other, but their relationship becomes complicated when they both get married to their respective girlfriends. That's Brokeback Mountain. And
Thank you, I'm proud of that writing.
you wrote that? Okay, I was gonna say. And here's the sort of IMDb log line for Portrait of a Lady on Fire. On an isolated island in Brittany at the end of the 18th century, a female painter is obliged to paint a wedding portrait for a young woman. And I'm like, okay, if I was someone who went by that, I would walk in thinking, this is a film about painting, and
It sounds kind of boring, to be honest.
It's gonna be like Rembrandt and Da Vinci and all of these people, just thinking silliness. And even when it had premiered at Cannes in 2019 and I was there to see it, it was the end of the night. It was like 10 o'clock. There was a showing, and I was like, I don't know if I want to go see a painting movie, man, at 10 o'clock at night. And then after I saw it and left, I was like, oh, that, I was kind of floating, because it was something I did not expect to see. And I think that has a lot to do with it, the way that film's promoted. And I do think sometimes there is a fear to promote women or non-binary folks in relationships with each other. And I guess it comes down to maybe there's some misogyny there, but also the fear of how to promote that. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that is a very real thing and something that we are constantly pushing for, to make explicit in marketing when it makes sense. For example, a movie not about painting, to make it explicit, because we as audiences, we want to go see ourselves. We want to see stories that we're represented in, and if we don't know they're even there, how are we supposed to be excited about that? And we have some statistics about how people are not often aware of when we're being represented because of a trailer. And so that's another component of how do critics decide what they're going to review, what they're going to see. And if the log line or the trailer is not showing what the movie is actually about, it's going to be a real problem for getting people into the theaters, which is something that is required for the industry to know that, oh, our stories are successful.
Do you know how mad I get at film festivals when a colleague will be like, oh, did you see that movie from wherever, the gay one? I'm like, that one was gay. It didn't say so in the program, and then I've missed it and it's too late. But I think, there's a tendency to not sort of lead with that, which affects the movie's life from beginning to end, really.
Yeah. Well, we should all tell them to come to NewFest.
Exactly.
Everything's gay. So we're out of time, but I just we had this amazing archive that we all looked at these last few days. So I just want you to briefly each tell me about one film that was formative to you, and you read these sort of old reviews now, and how would you have changed the conversation about that film? I mean, Valerie, I think your example about Portrait was amazing, but if you have another one, that's great, and I want to hear from Alex and Richard.
Okay, so I saw Orlando when I was a teenager. I was up late on the weekend when I shouldn't have been up, and it came on TV, and I think that was when I formally was I am into cinema. I love it. But when I went back to read some reviews, there was a critical misunderstanding of what the film was trying to accomplish. And I just think that it's one of those films that sort of needs revisiting, particularly by the trans and non-binary community, because of the different themes and things that the film deals with. I would love to see And I also think that I might like want to go back and review old movies because I think that might be fun, and recontextualizing that in the modern sense because so many of them still have resonance today, I think would be important. So I think I just opened up a new niche for myself.
Let's review all of the requirements films.
I mean, I think that as a critic, I can't labor under the delusion that my opinion is going to stand the test of time. It's just not going to happen. Mores change, society changes. And I think a movie for me that is a really interesting example of that is Jonathan Demme's Philadelphia, which won Oscars. It was a big financial hit, but there were a lot of people, Larry Kramer, other people in the AIDS activism community, the gay community, who at the time really hated that movie and thought it was this kind of pathetic attempt for Jonathan Demme to atone for the sins of Silence of the Lambs. And he said as much. He said that that's kind of why he made Philadelphia. And I, at the time, I was young, but even in my teenage years when the movie was at video stores, I was like, oh, that's just like bad Oscar bait, it's kind of like Hollywood junk. I rewatched it as an adult, and I think that's a beautiful, sensitive, thoughtful movie that kind of got mislabeled. And reading old reviews of it, there were a lot of gay critics who were, and I understand 100% why they felt that way at the time. They were living in the heat, the red hot center of this horrible crisis, and here comes Hollywood parachuting in. I get it, but I think removed from its context a little bit, that movie does interesting, thoughtful things, and so I kind of would urge people to rewatch that movie now that we kind of maybe have taken it for granted for 30 years.
To Richard's point, I think too, just like my opinion 10 years ago is not going to be the same as it is today. In producing films, I also know that a film that I produced 6 years ago is going to have very different meaning for the people that are watching it today than they did when it first came out. For me, Boys Don't Cry was life-saving, life-changing. I was 12 years old. It was the first time I saw a trans man in life or on screen anywhere. And it is entirely because of that film's critical and commercial success that it felt safe enough for me to rent it at Blockbuster and not have my parents blink twice. Because it was mainstreamed in that way, it allowed me to access that in a way that was socially acceptable as a kid. Now, it did delay my own self-acceptance for a decade, but I think what I would have added to the conversation, not that I could have, is I wish that there could have been more than just that, because I think no one piece of representation can or should bear the burden of representing an entire community or peoplehood. And so I appreciate it for what it was in the moment and what it did for me and also didn't do for me, and also how amazing it is that we've aged and progressed, that we can have these critical conversations about these things that have existed and helped formed where we are now.
I also just really quickly, I wanted to talk about The Watermelon Woman, because I know that hadn't been mentioned, but what that film did for me now, and how it's been sort of revisited and sort of re-examined in the cultural context, I think has been like a huge thing, because it's been difficult for me to go back in time and find those things that feature a Black woman as dark as Cheryl Dunye doing those things, and being able to see myself in it. So what I love is that now it's being ground, it's breaking new ground as a film that's from the 90s, and people are recognizing it, but also recognizing, hey, there isn't enough of this then or now, so how do we fix it?
Do more, let's get more.
Yeah, we need more. Valerie, Richard, Alex, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful conversation. I could talk to you all day long. But we have come to the end of this, so thank you so much for your time, for your humor, for your insight. Thank you, all of you, for joining us. I want to thank NewFest and NBCU for this wonderful partnership, and I want to thank, in particular, Dawn Pembleton on the RT team for adding over 200 reviews to these titles that you can all now go on. So thank you, Dom. that you can all now go and read and see what people said about these wonderful films. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Murtada.